Hey, welcome back. Fix INEC has been a major buzzword for the past few weeks now, with movements here and there calling for, well, an upgrade to Nigeria's electoral process. So it's about INEC, but it's about the larger electoral process, really, electoral reforms. Midway to 2027, few months away from the Anambra governorship election, so it's important to keep track of all these developments. And we're joined by Mr. Samson Itodo, right? He's Executive Director, Yaga Africa. He joins us virtually from Brussels. Mr. Itodo, you're welcome to the Morning Brief.
A very good morning to you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Before we get to that big talk around Fix INEC, what does a fixed INEC look like? How close are we to fixing INEC in that sense? But obviously the larger picture is electoral reforms. I just want to touch on the Anambra election, the coming Anambra election. So INEC released a list of the political parties, by extension, the candidates who participate in that. 16 of them, and campaigns are meant to begin on June the 11th. And from what you've seen so far, just to feel the pulse of you and perhaps other election watchers in the country, are you satisfied with the build-up to the Anambra governorship election?
Well, thanks, Kayode and Geoffrey. I think that to a large extent, the build-up to the Anambra elections clearly indicates that, yes, we are heading for perhaps what we might call a very interesting election, but also maybe a secured and peaceful election compared to the elections that held a few years ago. It is clear, unlike that election, where prior to the election there were issues around sit-at-home orders. It's not like it's not existing now, but I think to a large extent it's been curtailed. Yes, even though you have some measure of insecurity in Anambra, it's not in the scale that we saw prior to the last election. So it looks like we might have some peaceful election. In terms of INEC preparations, INEC has indicated that it is preparing for the elections. The publication of the list of candidates is a testament to that. We hope that there'll be increased voter education for the voters to understand why this election is important, but also how they can cast their vote. I think more importantly is the issue relating to voter registration. The continuous voter registration, whether new voters are going to be able to cast their votes ahead of the election. So if you look at the time, when will CVR be conducted and PVCs produced before the November elections? It is possible, but it's actually really very, very tight given our history. So on the whole, we can say it's still early days, but not so early. But as you can see from the parties, candidates have emerged. There are one or two controversies, but I think we are on course for the Anambra elections.
Well, we hope that all things go smoothly with that one, because I think it will also be some sort of foretaste to what to expect for 2027. We have, of course, other state elections ahead of that.
Well, the ones you should be looking forward to is the Osun election, which is the last election, and as you can
2027.
see, a lot of political intrigues happening in the state, which can impact on, how the election is conducted.
Certainly, we've seen the governor meeting. The PDP governor, by the way, meeting with the APC president and all of that. So obviously, as you said, it's going to be one of the litmus tests. So 16 political parties for that one, 14 male candidates, 2 female candidates for the Anambra election. But, the bigger picture, which is something you touched on as well, is the movement to fix INEC. Now, we've had lots of young people, some civil society, some not, just maybe influencers on social media who took it upon themselves and said, you know what, we need to do something different this time around. So when you hear fix INEC, do you resonate first with that movement? And what does a fixed INEC, or let me say fixed electoral system, look like for you?
Of course, I resonate with the call for fixing INEC. You guys know that 4 or 5 years ago, both Channels TV and Yaga Africa started this whole campaign around fixing Nigerians' elections. And so I completely identify with the struggle for a fixed INEC. Again, the conclusion for most election observers in the last election is that INEC and our electoral governance architecture requires fundamental reforms. And I'm really excited to see that citizens, are taking up this campaign, owning it, and demanding electoral reforms, because it's not just a role for civil society like Yaga Africa and the others. And so when we see movements of this nature, it really tells us that Nigerians have not given up on democracy. They've also not given up on our democratic institutions. What does a new INEC, a fixed INEC, looks like? There are three fundamental issues. The first one is that a fixed INEC is an independent INEC. A fixed INEC is an INEC that is not superintended by people who have partisan leanings. A fixed INEC is an INEC that has resident electoral commissioners who have not been involved in political campaigns, who don't have videos and social media posts of them campaigning, for a party. A fixed INEC is one where the Senate performs due diligence on the individuals that are appointed by the president. A fixed INEC is an INEC where the appointing authority is no longer the president, but vested in a multi-stakeholder institution as proposed by the Justice Ways Committee. So when you think about a fixed INEC, you think about INEC as an independent entity, because there's a reason why the independence of the Electoral Commission is non-negotiable, because elections are superintended over unbiased umpires. When you have biased umpires, when you have people who have partisan leanings, the results that you get are outcomes that are tainted and are not reflective of the will of the people. A fixed INEC is also an INEC that is competent. Coyote, 2 weeks ago, we saw that 3 resident electoral commissioners were removed from office based on an address by the president and 2/3 majority of the National Assembly. Why? Aside the fact that some of them were corrupt, they were involved in bribery, the other issue was incompetence. A classic example is the REC in Sokoto, the former REC in Sokoto. In fact, in the recent elections, you cannot compare the quality of the Edo elections and the Ondo elections, because the REC in Ondo, Barrister Mrs. Babalola, was a former director of legal at INEC. She had a competence. So when we say independent INEC, it's not just independent, but a competent INEC. Therefore, individuals who should go to INEC must have, the diversity of skills to manage elections. The second point, it's about the transparency of the results management process. The weakest link of our electoral process is that our results management process are so vulnerable to capture and manipulation. And this is why citizens are advocating that a fixed INEC is an INEC that transmits results electronically. And the only way the commission can do that is if the law clearly states that it is mandated to transmit results, but not a discretionary power that it has. Because when you give the commission discretionary power, in other words, if you say the commission may, the commission can decide not to transmit electronically, and then they would not be held liable, like the decision of the Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court has said that electronic transmission or the IREV is not part of the collation system, what we should be advocating the National Assembly to do is to make IREV, make electronic transmission part of the collation process, but not to substitute the manual process, because both of them will have to go hand in hand.
On that particular IREV issue, which is, I think it was a game changer. It's one of the things INEC brought in that was so innovative, generated a lot of enthusiasm, because at least for the first time in a long while, at that level, we can, get to see in real time
which they themselves eventually messed up. So, for instance, coming to work here at Channels TV, there are basically three ways the HR will know you came to work. You clock in, or if they see the CCTV cameras, and then those of us that are presenters, you see us on TV. So there are different ways to know. Now, for the IREV, it was only one of the best things it did was to help us build confidence in citizens to see real time how the voting is proceeding. Why do you think it's difficult to make sure that we elevate the status of the IREV to EC8A and make them part of the collating system? Because it's common sense. Why is common sense so hard to implement?
Well, common sense is so hard to implement if you have politicians who want to win elections at all costs and use power, not to solve the problems that people face, but to use power to primitively accumulate wealth or use power to oppress the people. The key question is, why do politicians have a budget to compromise INEC as part of their election expenses? The reason is simple. They want to force themselves on the people. So they put all sorts of pressure on INEC, on election officials, to do what? To undermine the process. The reason why you will not, there's lethargy, and reluctance to properly and legally institutionalize this is because of the potential that technology has for limiting human interference. Because they know very well that the beavers and the IREV are game changers. They have footprints. They can actually limit manipulation, even though they have their own challenges. But they are so scared of technology, not because we don't have the capacity, but because technology can leave imprints, it can leave footprints, and it can detect errors. And this is just the problem, because transparency, IREV ensures transparency. What IREV does, that at the polling units, when elections have been concluded, once results have been recorded on the EC8A, immediately the presiding officer, in the presence of everybody, takes an image of the results and puts it on the beavers and upload on the portal. When you do real-time upload, what it does is that for the politicians who are compromising collation officers, they can no longer do that because the results are already known. And so collation officers would also restrain themselves from manipulating the process, because if you check the entire value chain, you can detect where the error is. And this is just a real and fundamental reason. Forget all the excuses about technology penetration. That is just inexcusable, because the beavers was used in all the 154,000 polling units where election held in the 2023 elections.
Well, Mr. Itodo, it's a grim picture that you paint of, the status quo as far as the electoral process is concerned. But you were talking about what a fixed INEC looks like, and there's nothing wrong in dreaming. But what stands between Nigerians and that dream now is the 104 proposals that INEC has presented to the National Assembly. Yes, there are reports that the Commission has had an initial meeting with the Committee on Electoral Reform. What do you see in the resolve of that committee and indeed the National Assembly, the political will to commence the critical debate that will take us from here now to those reforms that will translate into a fixed INEC?
I think there are several, promising signs, I would say, with this reform process. And I'm very, very optimistic, because the National Assembly, the two committees in the Senate and the House have been involved in remarkable work and consultations on this issue. In fact, INEC has also articulated its own proposals for reforms. But there are 5 major reforms that can fix INEC and fix our electoral process, and we've talked about them. The first one is INEC's independence. How do we safeguard INEC's independence? The second one is electronic transmission of results. Make it mandatory and not discretionary in the electoral process. The third one is concluding all election matters, all election petitions before a winner of an election takes the oath of office. In other words, conclude election petitions before swearing in, because that way you create a level playing field for all. You don't give the incumbent an advantage, to interfere with the process or influence judicial outcomes. The fourth one relates to Electoral Offences Commission, that you have electoral impunity pervading every aspect of our electoral process, but you do need an institution that is independent to prosecute electoral offenders. And lastly, is opening up the process for voters to cast their vote, because the turnout for elections is very low. And in other words, like INEC is proposing, we shouldn't use the PVCs anymore. I see there's a lot of disinformation out there about this proposal, and perhaps I use this opportunity to correct that. That when we say that you need alternative forms of voter identification election day, it's for two reasons. One, the BVAS contains the register of voters, right? Therefore, if a voter shows up on the day of elections and they have their national identity or a passport or any other official identification, they should be allowed to cast their vote, because their facial and their biometrics is already on the BVAS. Because what we would have done is to protect the rights of most Nigerians, majority of Nigerians who couldn't vote in the last election because they didn't have their PVCs. And INEC is now saying you can download your PVCs, from the website. That way we open up the process and not make it difficult for people, because this thing about no PVCs, no vote, that aphorism is actually obsolete given our present reality.
Definitely. And we certainly look forward to that changing for 2027, even for the Osun election, right? We have about a minute to close, and I want you to speak to this, I wouldn't call it a controversy, but this INEC did not register a new political party because the coalition was hoping to have a new political party, right? So do you think that's overreaching? Do you think it's just INEC saying, well, it's what the law is, but there could have been a way to still find some arrangement to register a new political party, since there's some coalition backing that up? And the part where former minister said that if this current INEC chairman was the one in power, or at least at the helms in 2015, then the APC wouldn't have won.
Well, don't drag me into the politics of this. But I think to look at the question about party registration, political associations have a constitutional right for association. It's part of their right. And no institution should assault or undermine that right. The Constitution is clear on the procedure for registration of parties. Parties should strive to fulfill those conditions. And when they fulfill those conditions, INEC cannot deny a political party, registration. And where it does that, I encourage the parties to go to court and challenge it, because currently we've seen the court deliver judgments compelling INEC to recognize some political associations as parties. So INEC cannot and should not do that. It will be overreaching itself. It will be undermining the Constitution to fail to register parties, especially when those parties, have met the condition.
So I'm not going to drag into the politics of things. Let's just keep it at that. But we have to thank you so much for providing some more insight into this Fix INEC movement. It's something we'll stay with. We've been speaking with Mr. Samson Itodo, the Executive Director of YAGA Africa. Thank you for your time, and wish you the very best in your engagement.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we have a few feedback from our audience for you this morning. I think we could just start with this email from Amechi David about the border fence. Some are calling it a border wall already. And Amechi David says, my opinion about building borders to reduce the influx of terrorists suggested by the Chief of Defense Staff would work. These terrorists have sophisticated weapons that will blow down the walls. Building a wall will be a waste of resources. Building walls won't stop them from entering Nigeria, this user thinks.
Oh, we have this one from another user, the name is not there, but it's from a story from
That's
yesterday.
from Monday. What's up?
Oh, from Monday, okay. Monday says the attack on the community in Port Harcourt is to show how hanging this country called Nigeria is. I think in a normal sense of intelligence, when you suspect a place, send officers on foot patrol and surveillance and intelligence gathering of the suspected place, not just shooting from the aircraft. The Air Force has to pay for the damages done to the community, to both human and the environment. This is from Monday, and it's a reaction to the story from yesterday about the Air Force shooting from an aircraft on a community suspected to be involved in crude oil. But what we saw on ground was more like a palm oil situation. Yeah.
And it happened on May the 21st.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's so much on the show for today. Thank you so much for your time and company. I'm Jeffrey Uzoma. Bye-bye.
Sunrise Daily is up next, so stay with Channels Television all through the day. We got you covered. I am Bukola Koka.
And I'm Kayode Okikulu. Goodbye.